She heard the groan before she saw the blood. Elena dropped her mop. Her hand flew to her mouth. There on the cold basement floor lay a man half dead, his white shirt soaked through with crimson, his chest barely moving. She didn't scream. She didn't run. Something ancient and stubborn rose inside her chest instead, the same thing that had kept her alive through every hard year of her life. She knelt down beside a stranger who could destroy her world, and she chose to stay. If that kind of story moves you, subscribe right now. Hit that bell and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the beginning. The call came in at 7:45 on a Tuesday morning, and Elena almost didn't answer it. She was standing in her kitchen in Dorchester, one hand on a coffee cup that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, the other pressed flat against the counter because her back was aching again, the same deep grinding ache that had been her faithful companion for the last 3 years of hauling mops and lugging vacuum cleaners up and down other people's staircases. Her phone buzzed across the counter, and she glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Under normal circumstances, she would have let it go to voicemail. But normal circumstances hadn't visited Elena Vasquez in a very long time. She picked up. Ms. Vasquez. The voice on the other end was formal clipped male. This is calling on behalf of a property management firm. We have a job, a cleaning assignment for a residence in South Boston. It's urgent. The pay is triple your standard rate. Cash. Elena said nothing for a moment. Triple rate, cash. When, she asked. Today, this morning. She looked around her kitchen, the pile of overdue bills on the table. Noah's school lunch sitting half-packed on the counter, the cracked tile above the stove she'd been meaning to fix for 8 months. She thought about her son, 12 years old, and already too quiet, too careful around her, like he understood without being told that their margin for error was razor thin. Text me the address, she said. The mansion sat at the end of a dead-end street tucked behind a curtain of overgrown oak trees that hadn't been trimmed in what looked like years. Even in morning light, the place felt wrong. The kind of wrong that lives in your gut before your brain catches up. Elena pulled up in her rusted Honda Civic and sat for a moment behind the wheel. The house was enormous, 4 stories of old Boston money, the kind of stone and brick architecture that had been built to last centuries. But something had gone out of it. Every window on the ground floor was boarded. The front gate hung open at an angle like it had been left in a hurry and never come back to. Dead leaves had piled against the front steps in a thick, undisturbed layer. Nobody had been in or out of that door in a while. So who needs it cleaned? She almost called the number back. Almost. But then she looked at the envelope on the passenger seat, the one from the gas company, the one with the word "final" stamped across the front in red, and she got out of the car. The front door was unlocked. Not just unlocked, it was slightly open, as if someone had left in a hurry and couldn't be bothered with small things like security. Elena pushed it with 2 fingers and stepped inside. The air inside the mansion was cold and stale, and thick with the smell of old wood and something else underneath it that she couldn't quite name. She stood in the entryway and let her eyes adjust. The place was enormous inside a wide central hallway, a grand staircase rising to the upper floors, doorways leading off to rooms she couldn't see into yet. Dust covered everything in a fine gray layer. Old furniture stood like ghosts under white sheets. She had cleaned abandoned properties before. It wasn't pleasant work, but it paid. She told herself this was no different. She set down her supply bag, tied her hair back, and started with the hallway. For the first 40 minutes, nothing happened. Elena swept and wiped and moved methodically through the ground floor rooms the way she always did, working left to right, high to low, not rushing, not letting her mind wander too far. She was good at compartmentalizing. Years of single motherhood had taught her that. You put your worry in a box, you close the lid, and you work. You always work. But the house kept pushing back against her composure. Twice she heard the creak of the building shifting and froze with her broom in hand, heart hammering. Once she thought she saw a shadow move through the wow under a closed door at the end of the hall and stood staring at it for a full 30 seconds before deciding it was a trick of the light. The third time she heard something, it was not the house settling. It was a sound that came from below her feet. She stopped moving. She stopped breathing. A low sound, sustained, not mechanical, not structural, human. Hello. Her own voice surprised her. It came out steadier than she felt. Is someone there? Silence. Then it came again. Faint, desperate. A sound that bypassed logic and went straight to instinct, the part of the brain that knew before any conscious thought that something living was in pain. Elena stood at the top of the basement stairs and stared down into the dark. The door had been in the kitchen, partially hidden behind an old shelf unit that had been pushed aside just enough to create a gap, not enough to look deliberate, enough to look like someone had passed through recently. Her phone flashlight cut a narrow beam down the stairs. "Don't go down there," said the sensible part of her mind. "Call someone. Call the police. Get in your car and drive away." But that sound came again, ragged, helpless, barely human, and Elena Vasquez's feet were already on the stairs before she'd made any conscious decision at all. She smelled the blood before she saw him, copper and iron thick in the cold air. She swung the flashlight left, and the beam found a man on the floor collapsed against the far wall. Long legs stretched out in front of him, head dropped forward. One hand pressed weakly against his side. His white dress shirt was drenched, not stain-drenched, the kind of red that didn't leave room for hope. Oh, God. She was across the room in seconds, dropping to her knees beside him. Hey, can you hear me? I'm gonna call." "Don't." The word came out of him like it cost everything he had. His hand came up shaking violently and grabbed her wrist. His grip was weak, but his eyes, when they opened, were not. Dark eyes, burning with something that was not quite fever and not quite fear. "Don't call anyone," he rasped. "Not the police, not an ambulance, nobody." Elena stared at him. "You're bleeding to death," she said, because she needed him to understand the size of what he was asking. "I know what I am," he said. "You call anyone, we're both dead." The silence that followed those 5 words was the loudest thing Elena had ever heard. She looked at the man, really looked at him, the way she hadn't let herself do in the first shock of finding him. He was somewhere in his early 40s, she guessed. Dark-haired, heavy-set across the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been handsome once before life had rearranged it. His jaw was swollen on the left side. There was a cut above his eyebrow that had dried to a dark crust. His nose had been broken recently from the look of the swelling. But his eyes stayed fixed on her with a focus that didn't belong to a dying man. "Who are you?" she asked. His jaw tightened. "Someone you should walk away from." "That's not what I asked." A pause. His head fell back against the wall. When he spoke again, his voice was rougher, lower, like he was deciding something. "Crane," he said finally. "Dominic Crane." The name hit her like a physical thing. Elena sat back on her heels. Her mind scrambled, pulling the name up from a dozen different places. The front page of the Globe 3 weeks ago. The news anchor's voice on her kitchen radio. Dominic Crane, prominent businessman and alleged organized crime figure, reported missing following a... She'd turned that story off. She'd had her own problems. She stopped herself, looked at him again. "You've been missing. The whole city thinks you're dead." His mouth twisted. "Someone tried very hard to make that true. Someone did this to you." He met her eyes. "My brother." Elena had exactly 2 choices, and she knew it. She could stand up, walk up those stairs, get in her car, drive away, and never speak a word of this to anyone. She could fold this morning into a box the same way she folded every other hard thing, put it away, close the lid, survive. Or she could stay. Her hands, she noticed, were already moving, already pulling open the side pocket of her supply bag, where she kept the basic first aid kit she carried out of habit, a leftover instinct from years of worrying about Noah's scraped knees and her own accidents with cleaning chemicals. Bandages, antiseptic, medical tape, not nearly enough for this, but something. "This is going to hurt," she said. Dominic looked down at her hands and then back at her face, and something shifted in his expression that she couldn't quite read. Like she'd surprised him. Like being surprised was something that hadn't happened to him in a long time. "Everything hurts," he said simply. "Do what you need to do." She worked in silence for a while, and he let her. He sucked in a sharp breath when she pressed the antiseptic against the deepest of the wounds, a long gash along his left side that she suspected ran deeper than she could see. His hand shot out and gripped the floor, Knuckles' white jaw locked. But he didn't make a sound. He just breathed hard and controlled until the worst of it passed. "The wound's on your side," she said quietly, keeping her voice clinical, keeping the fear out of it the way she'd learned to do. These look like knife wounds. Multiple. How long have you been down here? 2 days, he said. Maybe 3. I lost track. She stopped what she was doing. 3 days. I said maybe. You could have an infection already. You could have internal bleeding. I don't know how to tell from the outside you need a hospital, Mr. Crane. What I need, he said very quietly, is for you to trust me when I tell you that if you walk me through that front door in the open, we will both be dead before we reach the end of the block. Elena looked at him. You're being dramatic. The look he gave her was entirely devoid of drama. My brother left me here with 2 men watching the perimeter. I got rid of them because I had 3 days to think about nothing else. But Marcus will send more. That's what he does. He's methodical. A pause. He gets it from me. She should have been terrified. The rational part of her brain was filing very strong complaints, but something else was operating. Some older layer of herself, the part that had survived her mother walking out when she was 9, her father's slow collapse into a bottle, the pregnancy at 22 that had left her completely alone with a baby and $40 in her checking account. The part of her that knew how to look at a situation and ask not, is this dangerous, but what needs to happen right now? Right now, a man needed to not die. She could have the existential crisis later. The knife wounds have the bleeding slowed, she asked. Mostly. The ones that haven't, I can't close properly. I can bind them, it'll hold for a while. She reached for the medical tape. The infection is the bigger problem. You're warmer than you should be. Do you have any medication in this house? Anything at all? There's a storage room at the back of the basement. The people who owned this place before left some things. Tell me what to look for. Boxes marked with a red cross. The previous owner had a condition. He kept supplies. She stood. Don't move. Where would I go? He said dryly. The storage room was exactly where he'd described it, and the boxes were exactly where he'd promised, stacked against the back wall, dusty but intact. Elena rifled through them with the focused efficiency of a woman who had been operating in crisis mode for most of her adult life. She found antibiotics, a prescription bottle with half the pills remaining, dated 3 years ago but sealed. She found a proper first aid kit unopened. She found saline solution in a roll of sterile gauze, and at the bottom of the second box, a bottle of water that was somehow still sealed. She stood in the doorway of the storage room, holding the antibiotics and listening. The house above her was completely silent. She didn't find that comforting. She was moving back across the basement, fast now, faster than she'd moved in years when she heard it. From upstairs, through the floor above her head, footsteps. She froze. Dominic had heard it too. His eyes were on the ceiling, tracking the sound, slow, deliberate, moving through what she calculated was the main hallway above them. One set of footsteps, unhurried, like whoever it was knew the house. The door, he said, his voice barely a breath. Did you close the door at the top of the stairs? She thought back, pictured herself descending, her hand on the railing, the door behind her. No, she whispered. His jaw tightened. The footsteps above them slowed, stopped. Elena looked at the open staircase behind her, at the rectangle of dim light at the top, at the fact that her supply bag was sitting in plain sight at the foot of the stairs, and understood with total clarity that she had maybe 30 seconds to make a decision. She crossed the room in silence and crouched beside Dominic. Is there another way out of this basement? Window, back wall, small, boards loose on the left side. She looked at him. At the bandaging she'd only half finished. At the pallor of his face and the way his breath was coming in shallow pulls. You can't go through a window, she said. I've gone through worse. Not with wounds like Elena. He said her name. First time he'd used it, it stopped her cold. I need you to listen to me very carefully. If Marcus's man finds you down here with me, he will not leave a witness. Do you understand what I'm saying? He will not leave you alive. She held his gaze. Her heart was slamming against her ribs. Above them, the footsteps started again. Moving toward the kitchen, moving toward the shelf unit, moving toward the basement door. The window, Dominic said. Go, now. I'm not leaving you. You have a son. The words landed like a blow. She hadn't told him about Noah. She hadn't said a word. How do you have a photo in your bag. He looks like you. His voice was rough but steady. Go through the window. Get to your car. Don't come back. Above them, something scraped against wood, the shelf being moved. Elena grabbed the antibiotics, grabbed the gauze, and she made the decision she would spend the rest of the night questioning. She moved to the window. The board came off easier than she'd expected. One hard pull, and it swung free. The window beyond was narrow and ground level, opening into a narrow passage between the house and the old stone wall of the property boundary. She pushed herself through head first arms, first shoulders, scraping and tumbled out onto cold ground. She didn't stop. She moved along the wall, staying low, staying close to the stone until she reached the far corner of the property. The rear gate was rusted but not locked. She pushed through it, and then she was on the back street, and then she was walking fast, not running because running draws eyes toward where she'd parked the Civic 2 streets over. She didn't look back. She didn't breathe properly until she was sitting behind the wheel with the door locked and the engine running and the heat beginning to push weakly through the vents. She sat there for 3 full minutes, hands on the wheel not moving. Then she looked down at the antibiotics in her lap, the gauze, the saline solution. She thought about Dominic Crane broken on a cold floor, burning with fever, with only half-finished bandaging and no water, and whatever was left of his strength. She thought about what he'd said. He will not leave you alive. She thought about Noah. She put the car in drive. And then, against every instinct for self-preservation she had ever developed in 41 years of hard living, Elena Vasquez turned the wheel back toward the mansion. She wasn't finished. She had never been good at being finished. She didn't know yet what it would cost her to stay. She didn't know that the man in that basement was about to change her life in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. But Elena Vasquez had made her choice, and in the world she was walking back into, choices like that had consequences that echoed for a very long time. If this story has you hooked, and I believe it does, drop your city in the comments right now. Let me see how far this is reaching. Like this video if Elena's courage moved you, and subscribe so you don't miss a single moment of what comes next. She drove back around the block twice before she let herself stop. Every rational thought she had was screaming at her to keep driving, to get on the highway, pick up Noah from school early, and pretend this morning had never happened. But rational thought had never been the loudest voice in Elena Vasquez's head. The loudest voice was the one that sounded like her grandmother, a small, stubborn woman from Guadalajara, who used to say that walking away from someone who needed you wasn't surviving. It was just a slower way of dying inside. Elena parked 2 streets east and went in through the rear gate again. The passage was dark and close, and she moved through it with the antibiotics tucked inside her jacket and the gauze wrapped tight in her fist. She kept her breathing slow, measured. The footsteps she'd heard earlier, whoever had been upstairs, she hadn't heard a car leave. That meant he was still there, or he'd left on foot, or he'd gone back into the house. None of those options were good. She reached the basement window and crouched, listening. Silence. She pressed her face close to the gap and said, barely above a breath, "Crane, it's me." Buzzing for 3 full seconds. Then his voice, low and rough and unmistakably careful. "You came back. I told you I wasn't finished. I told you to go home." "And yet," she said, and pushed herself back through the window. The landing was harder this time. She came down on her right knee and bit back the sound that rose in her throat. She found him exactly where she'd left him, which was either reassuring or deeply alarming, depending on how you looked at it. He hadn't moved. Couldn't, probably. But his eyes tracked her across the room with the same focused intensity as before, and she held on to that. Eyes like that meant a brain that was still fighting. "Man upstairs," she said, dropping down beside him and getting straight back to work on the bandaging. "Friend or enemy?" "Did you see him?" "No." "Then enemy." He pulled in a tight breath as she pressed the gauze against the gash on his side. "Marcus wouldn't send anyone I'd recognize by sight. He's smarter than that." "Is he gone?" "For now." His jaw worked. "He'll have reported back. We have maybe 2 hours before someone else comes." Elena didn't answer. She was focused on the wound, on the heat radiating off the skin around it, the angry red that had already crept an inch beyond where it should have been. She opened the antibiotic bottle and shook 2 pills into her palm and looked at him. 3 years old, she said, holding them up. "Best I could find. Give them to me." "They might not." "Elena." His voice was steady in a way that cost him something. "I have been stabbed 3 times, beaten, and left in a basement for 3 days by my own flesh and blood. I'm not particularly concerned about the expiration date. She handed him the pills. He got them down with a sip from the water bottle she'd brought and closed his eyes for exactly 4 seconds. She counted, then opened them again. Talk to me, she said, working on the binding. Keep yourself awake. About what? About Marcus. About what happened. About anything. She pulled the gauze tighter, and he sucked in a breath. Sorry, I need it firm. It's fine. He was quiet for a moment, and then, what do you want to know? How does a man end up in a basement put there by his own brother? The sound he made wasn't quite a laugh. It was darker than that, more tired. You want the honest version or the version that makes me look better? I'm kneeling on a concrete floor in an abandoned building, bandaging a man the whole city thinks is dead, she said flatly. I think we're past the version that makes you look better. He was quiet long enough that she thought he'd decided not to answer. Then he said, Marcus came to me 8 months ago, told me he wanted in, told me he'd spent 20 years on the outside of everything I'd built, and he was done waiting. A pause. I laughed at him. Elena kept her hands moving, kept her face neutral. Why? Because Marcus is my father's son from a woman who wasn't my mother. My father brought him into the house when Marcus was 13 and I was 18, and I spent the next 5 years making sure he understood exactly how that hierarchy worked. He stopped. Something moved through his expression, not guilt exactly, something older and harder to name. I was not kind to him, and he's been holding on to that for 20 years, apparently. So when you laughed, he smiled back. His voice dropped. That's the thing I keep coming back to. He smiled, told me I was right that he'd been foolish to ask, and then he shook my hand and left. Another pause. 2 months later, I find out 3 of my most trusted men had been flipped. Meetings I thought were private had been recorded. And Marcus had been quietly building something I didn't see coming because I didn't think he had it in him. He exhaled slowly. I was wrong. I've been wrong about Marcus for 20 years. Elena finished the binding and sat back. She looked at the man in front of her, at the swollen jaw, the dried blood on his brow, the labored rise and fall of his chest, and she thought about what it meant to underestimate someone for 2 decades. She knew something about that, though, from the other direction. Why this house? She asked. Why should I? Here. Joe. It was mine, he said, before I built the other properties. This was the first thing I ever bought. Marcus knew that. He chose it deliberately. A beat. That's what a man does when he wants to humiliate you. He doesn't just destroy you. He destroys you in the place that meant the most. Nice brother, Elena said. He wasn't always. She looked up. Dominic's eyes were somewhere else, somewhere behind her, somewhere in a past she couldn't see. There was a time he was maybe 15. I was 20 when he got jumped walking home from school. 3 kids older. I found out about it, and I found those 3 kids. His jaw tightened. Nobody touched Marcus after that. For years, nobody touched him. And he was grateful in the way that a young kid is grateful totally, completely. Like I was the whole world. What changed? I did. His eyes came back to her. Flat and honest in a way that was harder to look at than the wounds. I got power, and I stopped being someone worth being grateful to. The silence that followed sat between them like a third presence in the room. Elena didn't feel it. She'd learned a long time ago that some truths needed space to breathe. Then from directly above them, a sound. Not footsteps this time. A door. The heavy particular slam of the front door, and then 2 seconds later, voices. More than one. Dominic was already trying to move. Elena put a hand flat on his chest. How many? She asked, barely moving her lips. He held up 2 fingers, then paused. 3. The man from before brought backup, he said. Can they hear us? Not if we're quiet. His hand closed around her wrist, not rough, not desperate. Just present. Grounding. Don't move. Don't speak. Let them sweep the floor above them and leave. And if they don't leave, he looked at her, then we deal with that when it comes. Lena sat in the cold dark of that basement with a Mafia Boss's hand around her wrist and 3 unknown men walking the floor above her head. And she thought with a clarity that almost made her want to laugh that she had not told anyone where she was going this morning. Not her neighbor, Mrs. Carver, who picked up Noah on Tuesdays. Not her friend, Daria. Nobody. She had just driven across the city and walked into an abandoned mansion because a stranger on the phone offered her triple rate and she had bills on her kitchen table. 41 years old and she still hadn't learned. The voices above them shifted, moving left, moving toward the kitchen. A thud, something being knocked over. Then a voice closer now, directly above the basement door, and she heard it clearly enough to make out words. It checked the whole floor. Nothing. A second voice muffled further away. Then the first voice again. Irritated. He's not here. Either he crawled out or he was moved. A pause. Call Marcus. Tell him we need another team on the perimeter. Elena and Dominic locked eyes. Marcus's name said out loud by one of Marcus's men in the house where Marcus had left Dominic to bleed out. And they were calling Marcus right now, standing 8 feet above them. Dominic's grip on her wrist tightened slightly. She didn't move. The footsteps moved away from the kitchen, back down the hallway, toward the front. She counted 20 seconds. 30, and then the front door opened and shut again, and the house went silent. She let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for a week. They're gone, Dominic said, but he didn't say it like someone who was relieved. He said it like someone who understood that gone was temporary. Marcus knows you're not here, Elena said. Marcus knows I'm not confirmed dead, he corrected. That's different, and worse. He shifted and she could see from the way his face changed that the movement cost him. He'll widen the search, hospitals, clinics, anyone I trust. Who do you trust? A beat. Not many people. Is there anyone who can help you actually help you, not just James Chen, he said. He's been with me for 15 years. Former military. If he's still free, if Marcus hasn't gotten to him, James can get me somewhere safe. He looked at her steadily. But I need a phone, not mine. Mine is either dead or being traced. Elena reached into her jacket and pulled out her own phone. He looked at it, then at her. If I call James from your number, then Marcus can trace the call to one, she finished. I know. Elena, tell me the number, she said. He held her gaze for a long moment. That unreadable thing moved through his expression again, the one that looked like surprise except deeper, like he was recalibrating something. He told her the number. She dialed. It rang 3 times and she had almost convinced herself it was going to voicemail when a man's voice picked up sharp and immediate. Who is this? My name is Elena Vasquez, she said. I'm with Dominic Crane. He's alive. He needs, where are you? The sharpness in the voice shifted into something different. Focus at urgent, stripped of everything that wasn't essential. She gave him the address. 40 minutes, James Chen said. Don't open the door for anyone else. Don't let him move. Don't call anyone. A pause that lasted exactly 1 second. And Ms. Vasquez, you did the right thing. The line went dead. Elena lowered the phone. Her hand was shaking slightly. She noticed it the way you notice weather from inside a building. Distantly, as information. He's coming, she said. Dominic closed his eyes. For the first time since she'd found him, some of the iron tension in his face let go just slightly. Just enough to see what was underneath, which was a man who had been holding himself together through nothing but will for 3 days and was reaching the end of what will alone could do. Why? He asked. His voice was quieter now, less controlled. Why are you still here? He opened his eyes and looked at her directly, and there was nothing tactical in it, nothing calculating. Just the question, plain and genuine. You don't know me. You owe me nothing. You have a child at home. Why are you still in this basement? Elena thought about the honest answer. She thought about her mother walking out of a grocery store when Elena was 9 years old and simply not coming back. She thought about what it had done to her, that specific abandonment, that specific shape of being left, and how she had spent her whole adult life making sure she was never the one who walked away from someone who needed her. Even when it was hard, even when it was stupid, even when every intelligent instinct said go. She didn't say any of that. What she said was, I found you. That makes you my responsibility until someone better qualified shows up. He looked at her for a long moment. That's a dangerous philosophy. I know, she said, but it's mine. The 40 minutes felt like 4 hours. She kept him talking not because she thought conversation would save him, but because silence let the fever climb, and the fever was the enemy she understood least and feared most. She'd seen infection work fast. She'd watched her father deteriorate from a wound he'd ignored for too long and hadn't fully understood until years later what had actually been happening inside his body. She wasn't going to watch it happen to someone else she'd made herself responsible for. So she talked and she asked questions, and she made him answer even when answering was clearly an effort. She learned that he'd grown up in South Boston, not the mansion, a much smaller house 2 neighborhoods over. That his father had been both feared and respected in equal measure, and had raised Dominic to understand that fear and respect were functionally the same thing until you were old enough to know the difference. That there had been a woman once before the empire consumed everything else, and that he'd made choices that ended it before it could become something real. She learned that he'd built the criminal network not because he loved power, but because power was the only language his father had ever spoken to him, and children learn the language they're raised in. She learned that he had not spoken to his father in 6 years, and that his father had died 4 years ago, without them ever having another conversation. "Did you go to the funeral?" she asked. "Yes." "Did it help?" "No." A pause. "I thought it would. I thought watching him go into the ground would close something, but it just moved the wound to somewhere I couldn't reach it." Elena nodded slowly. She understood that more than she could explain. Then she heard the car outside, the low idle of an engine stopping on the back street, and she was on her feet before the thought was fully formed. "That's either James," she said, "or we have a very serious problem." "If it's James," Dominic said, ready trying to get himself into some kind of upright position, "he'll knock 3 times, pause then twice. It was a code we set up years ago." He paused. "If it's not that, run," she finished. "Run, Monique." He agreed. She moved to the window and waited. 3 knocks, a pause, 2. She let out a breath that felt like it came from somewhere very deep. "It's James." The man who came through the basement window was built like someone who had spent a serious portion of his life making sure he was never the least dangerous person in any given room. James Chen was somewhere in his mid-40s, compact and precise, in the way of someone who moved with economy, nothing wasted, nothing accidental. He took in the room in a single sweep, landed on Dominic, and something crossed his face so fast Elena almost missed it. Almost. She caught it. Pain. Real, unguarded, the kind that only shows up between people who have stood next to each other through things that don't get talked about out loud. "Boss," he said. "James." Dominic's voice had changed, lost something formal. "How bad is it?" Outside, James glanced at Elena, then back. "Marcus has been busy. 3 of our lieutenants have been approached. 2 flipped. Rivera held." A pause. "Roman Castellano reached out to Marcus 2 weeks ago. They've been in talks." The name Castellano landed differently on Dominic than any of the other information had. She watched his face go still, a different kind of still, then pain, a controlled, dangerous stillness that she imagined was what he looked like when he was thinking at his most lethal. "Roman Castellano, bomb," he said quietly. "Marcus went to Castellano." "Looks that way." "Then it's not a family dispute," Dominic said. "It's a takeover." That's how I read it. Elena stood between them, listening to this, to a language she didn't speak, built from years of a world she'd never touched, and she understood that the situation was considerably larger than one man in a basement. This wasn't just a brother's betrayal. This was an orchestrated removal. A hostile acquisition of everything Dominic Crane had spent 20 years building, and Marcus had been planning it long enough and carefully enough to bring in outside players. "We need to move him," James said, turning to Elena. "Can he travel?" "He shouldn't be moving at all," she said. "He needs a real doctor. The wound's on his left side." "I know someone," James said. "Off-grid, trustworthy." "How trustworthy?" James looked at her steadily. "I trust her with my life. I'm asking you to trust her with his." Elena looked at Dominic. He was watching her, not James, not the window, not the exit. Her. Like the decision was somehow hers to make, which was absurd, which was completely irrational, and which also somehow felt exactly right. "Get him up carefully," she said. "Left side supported. And if he goes down, you stop moving and you let me assess before you do anything else." "Understood." James Chen, a man who she suspected had not taken direction from many people, in many years, looked at her for exactly 1 second and then said, "Understood." It took 6 minutes to get Dominic from the floor to the car on the back street. 6 minutes that aged Elena considerably more than they should have. He bore most of his own weight, which was the only reason it was possible. She held his left side steady, and James took the right, and they moved in a kind of deliberate, careful choreography that had no room for error. He made no sound the whole way. That was either very impressive or very alarming. She hadn't decided which. When James had him in the back seat, Elena stood on the back street and looked at the car and understood suddenly clearly that the logical thing was to stay here, to let them drive away, to walk back to her Civic, go pick up Noah, and let this dissolve into the category of things that had happened to her that she would never talk about. She was already reaching for her phone to tell Noah's school to release him to Mrs. Carver when Dominic's voice came from the open car window. Elena, she stopped. I meant what I said about your son. His voice was rough but clear. If Marcus finds out you were here, what you saw, what you did, Noah becomes a liability to him. You understand what I'm telling you. She understood exactly what he was telling her. She stood very still in the cold air of that back street and felt the world she'd known 3 hours ago receding behind her like a tide going out, and she knew with the same gut-level certainty she'd felt walking into this house that it was not coming back. Get in the car, James Chen said not unkindly. Both of you are safer moving than standing still. Lena looked back once at the alley, at the narrow gap in the stone wall that had been her exit and her entrance all morning. Then she got in the car. The car had been moving for 11 minutes when Dominic lost consciousness. Not slowly, not with warning. One moment he was answering James's clipped questions from the back seat, names, locations, access codes, rattled out in a voice held together by pure discipline. And the next his head dropped against Elena's shoulder and his whole body went heavy and silent. James, her voice was flat and controlled, and she was already pressing 2 fingers to the pulse point at his neck. He's out. How's his pulse? Fast, too fast. She pulled back the edge of the bandaging she'd applied and checked the gauze underneath. The bleeding had slowed, but not stopped entirely, and the skin around the deepest wound was hot in a way that made her stomach tighten. The infection is moving faster than the antibiotics can catch up. How much further? 8 minutes. Drive like it's 5. James drove like it was 4. The safe house turned out to be above a dry cleaning business in Quincy, a walk-up apartment with thick curtains and a woman named Dr. Suyon Park waiting inside with the particular calm of someone who had been called to difficult situations before and had made her peace with it years ago. She was small, precise, somewhere in her 60s, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a medical bag already open on the kitchen table. She took one look at Dominic being half carried through the door and said simply, "Get him down. Get everyone else out of my way." Elena stepped back. It was the hardest thing she'd done all day, and she had already done several very hard things. For the next 40 minutes, she sat in the narrow hallway outside the apartment's main room and listened to the quiet, focused sounds of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, the soft clink of instruments, the low murmur of doctor. Park talking herself through procedure, the occasional sharp instruction directed at James, who had apparently assisted in situations like this before and didn't need to be told twice about anything. Elena sat with her back against the wall and her knees pulled up and called Noah's school and told them Mrs. Carver would be picking him up today. Something had come up at work. The woman on the phone said, of course, no problem. Noah's name on a school secretary's lips, spoken in a completely ordinary Tuesday afternoon voice, felt like a transmission from a parallel world. When she hung up, she sat for a moment, just holding the phone. Then she called Mrs. Carver. "It might be a late one," she said, keeping her voice light, keeping it the voice of a woman with an ordinary Tuesday. "I'm really sorry. I'll make it up to you." "Oh, honey, don't worry," Mrs. Carver said. "He can have dinner here. You take care of whatever you need to take care of." Elena thanked her and ended the call and pressed the phone against her chest and let herself have exactly 30 seconds where the fear was allowed to be as large as it actually was. 30 seconds of sitting in that hallway, understanding that she had walked into something that had no clean exit, that her phone number was now in Dominic Crane's story, whether she wanted it to be or not, that Marcus Crane, a man who had orchestrated a 3-day torture and abandonment of his own brother, now potentially had a thread that led directly to her and to a 12-year-old boy who had no idea any of this was happening. 30 seconds. Then she put the phone in her pocket and stood up because 30 seconds was all she could afford. James was in the hallway when she stood leaning against the opposite wall, arms crossed, watching her with an expression that was professionally neutral but not entirely uninvested. "She'll stabilize him," he said. It wasn't reassurance exactly. It was information. "How long has she been doing this?" "Long enough that I stopped asking questions about her past and she stopped asking questions about mine." He paused. "She's good. Better than good." Elena nodded. "Then tell me about Marcus." Something shifted in James Chen's face. Not surprised, he didn't seem like someone who was easily surprised, but a kind of recalibration, like he was deciding how much to say to a woman he'd known for under an hour. "What do you want to know?" he asked. "Everything that you think I need to know to keep myself and my son safe." That landed plainly, and he respected it. He uncrossed his arms and looked at the closed door for a moment, and then he started talking. Marcus Crane, according to James, was patient in a way that most dangerous men were not. Most dangerous men were reactive. They moved on anger, on pride, on the immediate calculus of threat and response. Marcus had spent 20 years absorbing insults that would have made other men explode and had converted every single one of them into fuel for something long and cold and carefully planned. He had built relationships inside Dominic's organization that nobody knew about, not even James, until 2 weeks ago, and that knowledge clearly still sat uncomfortably in him. He had waited until the moment the foundation had enough cracks, and then he had not attacked. He had simply removed the cornerstone and let the structure begin to collapse on its own. The alliance with Roman Castellano was the part that troubled James most. "Castellano is not a local problem," he said. "His reach goes up the coast. If Marcus has promised him a share of the territory in exchange for backing, then this isn't about family anymore. It's about market share. And the FBI has been watching Castellano for 2 years. Is that good or bad for us?" "Depends on the day," James said. "And what Dominic decides to do when he's back on his feet." Elena looked at the closed door. "When he's back on his feet," she repeated, as if saying it out loud made it more likely to be true. The door opened 23 minutes later, and Dr. Park came out, pulling her gloves off. She looked at Elena directly, not James. Elena, which was interesting, and she filed it away. "He'll live," the doctor said. "The infection was aggressive, but we caught it before it went systemic. The wounds are properly closed now. He needs 48 hours of rest minimum, IV antibiotics, no movement, no stress." She paused with something that was almost a smile. "Tell him that last part. I have a feeling he'll need to hear it more than once." "Can I see him?" Elena asked. The doctor looked at her for a moment with the evaluating steadiness of someone who had spent a lifetime reading situations quickly. "5 minutes," she said. "He's awake. He shouldn't be, but he is. Don't let him talk too much." She went in. Dominic was propped up, slightly IV line, taped to the back of his hand, his color still bad, but less terrifying than it had been on that basement floor. The iron tension had gone out of him, not because he'd surrendered it, she realized, but because his body had simply overruled him. For the first time since she'd found him, he looked like a man and not a fortress. He looked at her when she came in. "You should go home," he said. His voice was rough with exhaustion and medication. "You keep saying that. You keep not doing it." She sat in the chair beside the makeshift bed and looked at him steadily. "Marcus sent men to that house today. After I left the first time and came back, they were upstairs. They called him." She watched his face. "He knows you're not there. He'll be widening the search. James told me about Castellano." The name tightened something in his face, even through the medication. "James talks too much." "James talks exactly as much as the situation requires," she said. "Which means I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." "I've been honest with you." "More honest than I expected," she admitted. "Here's the question. Marcus knows the general area. He doesn't know about this location yet. But how long before someone in your organization gives him something that narrows it down? You said 2 lieutenants already flipped." Dominic was quiet for a moment. He was thinking she could see it behind his eyes, working through layers of information she didn't have access to, sorting and evaluating, with the speed of a man who had spent 20 years having to think faster than the people around him. 48 hours, he said finally. "Maybe less." "Then we have 48 hours." We, he repeated, and there was something careful in how he said it. I'm in this whether I chose it or not, Elena said. My number called James. If Marcus pulls phone records and James said he has people inside the department, he finds my number. From my number, he finds my name. From my name, he finds my address and my son's school. She kept her voice even because the alternative was not useful. So yes, we. He held her gaze and she saw him move through something complicated, an instinct to push her away, wrestling with the reality of everything she just laid out, and the reality won. 48 hours, he said again. James has a plan for moving me. There's a location outside the city secured that Marcus doesn't know about because I've never told anyone about it. Not even James. It was always a last resort. Tell James now. I know. And Marcus, she said. What's the plan for Marcus? He looked at her for a long moment. That, he said quietly, is a conversation for when I can stand up without help. She accepted that. She stood to leave, and then she stopped because something he'd said back in the basement, what felt like a different lifetime, had been sitting in the back of her mind like a stone she kept stepping around. In the basement, she said, you told me that if Marcus's man found me with you, he wouldn't leave a witness. That was, she paused, measured it. That was a very specific thing to know about your brother. Dominic didn't look away. Yes. Has Marcus done that before? Left no witnesses? The silence that answered her was its own answer. There was a man 3 years ago, Dominic said, a city councilman who saw something he shouldn't have at a meeting Marcus was not supposed to be at. The councilman died in a car accident 6 days later. He stopped. It wasn't an accident. Elena stood very still. And you knew this? I found out afterward. And Marcus was already gone by the time I found out, moved himself to New York for 6 months. His jaw tightened. I told myself it was an isolated decision, that he'd panicked, that it wouldn't happen again. But it did. I don't know for certain about after. But I know what he's capable of. And I know that if he believes for 1 second that you're a loose thread. He stopped, and she could see the effort it cost him to hold her gaze and say the next part. I will not let that happen. It wasn't a romantic declaration. It was a statement of intent from a man whose statements of intent had historically carried weight. She took it as such. She left him to sleep and found James in the front room, already on his phone, moving pieces around a board she couldn't fully see. She didn't interrupt. She stood at the window, curtains drawn, so she stood beside the edge and watched the street below at the narrow angle available to her, because standing still wasn't something she was capable of right now. She thought about Noah having dinner at Mrs. Carver's. She thought about him sitting at that familiar table eating something ordinary, completely unaware. She thought about the distance between his ordinary Tuesday in this room and everything it contained, and something fierce and protective rose in her chest that was so strong it almost hurt. She was still standing there when James finished his calls and came to stand beside her. I reached out to a contact at the FBI field office, he said without preamble. She turned to look at him. Oh, you went to the FBI. An agent named Carla Webb. She's been building a case against Castellano for 18 months. Dominic's situation, if it can be documented and presented correctly, gives her what she needs to move. He paused. It also gives Dominic leverage he doesn't have right now. Does Dominic know you did this? Not yet. He's going to have thoughts about that. He's going to have thoughts about a lot of things in the next 48 hours, James said with the exact tone of a man who had navigated his employer's thoughts for 15 years and had developed a methodology. My job is to make sure he's alive to have them. Elena nodded slowly. She thought about what Dominic had said, 48 hours, maybe less. She thought about Marcus sending more men methodically the way Dominic had described him. Methodical, patient. 20 years of patience compressing itself into a final decisive push. James, she said, what happens if Marcus finds this location before you move him? James didn't answer immediately. He looked at the window beside her in that narrow angle that showed a strip of the ordinary street below. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. His expression didn't change, which was the most alarming thing she had seen all day, because she had already learned that James Chen's face was a controlled instrument, and controlled instruments flicker when something genuinely bad arrives. He picked up, said nothing, listened for 12 seconds. Then he ended the call and looked at Elena and said 4 words with the focused calm of someone delivering information that cannot be softened. Marcus knows we moved. Elena felt the cold come through the wall without the wall changing at all. Bum. The car. His jaw tightened. I borrowed it from a contact. The contact didn't mention he'd reported it stolen last week. There's a tracker on it, standard recovery system. If someone ran the plates in the last 2 hours, Marcus's people in the department, Elena said. Yes, she calculated. They'd arrived maybe 70 minutes ago. If the plates had been run close to arrival, if someone had passed the street and noted the car and run it, Marcus could already have an address. Could already be moving. How long was she asked? We need to assume we don't have any. She was already moving toward the back room. Then we need to move Dominic. Right now. The doctor said 48 hours. I heard what the doctor said. She was at the door to the back room, her hand on the frame, and she turned back and looked at James with the complete direct certainty of a woman who had made calculations like this her entire life. And I also heard that if we stay here and we're wrong about the timeline, he doesn't get 48 hours. He gets nothing. Which option do you want to bet on? James Chen looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then he was moving. She pushed the door open. Dominic was already awake. She suspected he'd never fully gone under. Way some people in danger didn't, some alarm system in the body overruling the need for rest. He looked at her face and he read it accurately and immediately. We're moving, he said, not a question. Right now. The location I mentioned. Tell James in the car. She was already at the IV line looking at what could be managed in transit and what couldn't. Can you stand? He answered by pushing himself upright, and she saw every line of his body absorb the pain of that motion and convert it into something else, something colder, something that was beginning to look. She thought not like a man trying to survive, but like a man starting to think about what came next. That distinction mattered. It scared her a little, and underneath the fear somewhere she didn't want to look at too carefully, yet it steadied her too. James came through the door with Dr. Park's mobile kit in one hand and his own jacket in the other. He handed the jacket to Dominic without a word. Dominic took it. Their efficiency together had the quality of a long partnership, not warm, not cold, just deeply practiced. Backstairs, James said. There's an exit through the dry cleaning space. I'll bring the car around to the service alley. Not the same car, Elena said sharply. James almost smiled. Different car. I called ahead 2 minutes ago. He looked at Dominic. 30 seconds. Be ready. He was gone before Dominic could respond. Dominic stood slowly holding the wall but standing and looked at Elena across the room. Something was different in his face now. The vulnerability of the last hour had been put somewhere else, somewhere interior, where he kept the things he didn't show. But it hadn't disappeared. She knew it hadn't because she'd seen it, and you can't unsee what a man looks like when he's told the truth about himself in a cold basement with no audience and nothing left to protect. You have a plan, she said. You've been building one since the basement. I've been building one since the moment I woke up and understood Marcus had actually done it, he said. Yes. Does it keep Noah safe? It keeps Noah safe first, he said. Everything else after that. She held his gaze, decided to trust that. Not because she was naive, she was the least naive person she knew, but because she understood in the particular way that came from a lifetime of reading people who needed something from her, that Dominic Crane was not lying, not about this. From below them, the quiet knock of a car door closing on a back alley street. Let's go, she said, and they went. The second car was a dark sedan that smelled like coffee and old leather, and James drove it the way he did everything else with an economy of movement that suggested he had rehearsed for emergencies so many times that emergencies had simply become a category of normal. Dominic sat in the back with Elena beside him, one hand braced against the door, the other flat on his knee. She watched him breathe, counted the rise and fall of his chest the way she'd taught herself to do in those first terrible weeks after Noah was born, when she'd sit up in the dark next to his bassinet, convincing herself that one more breath meant one more breath meant one more breath. Some habits of vigilance never left you. They just found new subjects. The location, James said from the front. I need it now. Marshfield, Dominic said. There's a property under a holding company called Alderton Coastal Group. It won't trace back to me through any search Marcus can run. I bought it through 3 layers of incorporation 6 years ago and never told a single person it existed. Why? Elena asked. He looked at her. Because I always knew somewhere that one day I might need a room that nobody could find. James was already adjusting their route. Elena felt the car change direction, and she looked out the side window at the city moving past ordinary people on ordinary sidewalks, living ordinary Tuesday afternoons, and she thought about how thin the membrane was between that world and this one. How you could be on one side of it your entire life and then step through in a single morning without even meaning to. Noah, she said quietly, not really to either of them. Then to Dominic, I need to know he's protected. Not just, not just words. Actually protected. James, Dominic said. Already working on it, James said from the front. There's a woman I trust, former protection detail, completely off Marcus's radar. She can be at Mrs. Carver's address within the hour. She'll stay with the boy until this is resolved. Elena turned to look at James. How do you know Mrs. Carver's address? I know your address, James said with a steadiness that might have been frightening under different circumstances. I know Noah's school, his teacher's name, and the bus route he takes on Fridays. I ran a full background check from the car when Dominic called me from your phone. The silence that followed was interesting. And, Elena said, and you're clean, James said. Completely, no record, no affiliations, no complications. You are exactly what you appear to be. He paused, which in my experience is extraordinarily rare. Dominic almost smiled. She caught the edge of it. I'm going to need a number for your woman, Elena said. A real one. One I can call if something changes with Noah. You'll have it in 5 minutes. She settled back. Her knee was pressed slightly against Dominic's, and neither of them moved to change that, and she was too tired and too wired to examine what that meant. They drove. The property in Marshfield was a single-story house, set back from a coastal road bordered on 3 sides by trees, and on the 4th by an old stone wall. It had the intentional anonymity of something built to be forgettable, neutral quiet, geometrically plain. The kind of place your eyes slid off of without registering. Elena had cleaned enough wealthy properties to recognize when the absence of ostentation was its own form of expensive. Getting Dominic inside was faster this time. He was stronger than he'd been an hour ago, which was either the antibiotics beginning to reach critical mass, or willpower, or some combination of the two that she suspected was mostly the second thing. Doctor Park had not come with them. James had called her from the car and explained the situation in 3 sentences, and she had responded by telling him what to do with the portable IV setup and what signs to watch for and what to do if those signs appeared. And she had done all of this in the tone of a woman who had long since stopped being surprised by the complications of her professional life. Elena set up the IV herself. James watched, and she could feel him recalibrating, again, and adjusting some assessment of her downward from liability towards something more useful. She didn't say anything about it. She just worked. When Dominic was settled and the line was running and his vitals were as stable as she could determine with what she had, she went to the kitchen and stood at the counter and called Noah. He picked up on the second ring. Hey, Mom. His voice, 12 years old and still not quite settled into whatever it was becoming. Still carrying the last traces of the smaller boy she'd memorized, hit her somewhere in the solar plexus. Hey, baby, she said, and kept her voice all the way normal, a complete performance. How was school? Fine. Mrs. Carver made lasagna. The good kind, or the kind with the weird cheese? He almost laughed. The good kind. A pause, the particular pause of a 12-year-old calibrating. Mom, are you okay? You sound weird. Long day, she said. I'm good. I'll be home late. Mrs. Carver's going to stay with you. Is that okay? Yeah, another pause. How late? I don't know yet, but Noah, listen to me. She stopped, edited herself. She couldn't say what she wanted to say, which was, I love you past the point of measurement, and I made some choices today that scare me, and if anything happens, you need to know you have always been the best thing I ever did. She couldn't say any of that because he was 12 and perceptive and would hear every word underneath those words. So instead, she said, don't stay up too late, and if anyone you don't know comes to the door, you don't answer it. You get Mrs. Carver, okay? Okay, he said slowly, and she heard him filing it away somewhere, storing it, the way kids stored things they didn't understand yet, but intended to return to. Good, I love you. Love you too, Mom. A beat. The weird kind or the good kind? She laughed, a real one, short and startled out of her. The good kind. Always. She hung up and stood for 30 seconds with her hand flat on the counter and let herself feel everything she was too busy to feel in motion. Then she put it away, closed the lid, walked back in. Dominic was awake. He'd been listening not to her conversation. He couldn't have heard it from the other room, but to whatever was happening inside himself, the internal negotiation between damage and determination that she'd been watching him conduct since the basement. He's fine, she said before he could ask. Noah's fine. James has someone going to Mrs. Carver's. Good. He looked at her directly. Sit down, Elena. She sat, the chair beside him. Same angle as the safe house, which felt like something from another era instead of 2 hours ago. I need to tell you something, he said, about Marcus and about what I intend to do. You've earned the right to know, and I'm tired of managing information around you because you're clearly better at handling information than most of the people I've paid for 20 years. She inclined her head. James contacted Agent Carla Webb at the FBI, he said, which I know. I heard him on the phone from the other room. He let that settle. I'm not angry about it. I would have resisted it an hour ago before I understood how far Marcus has already moved. But Castellano changes the geometry of this. Marcus alone, Marcus is a family problem. Marcus with Castellano is a federal problem, and federal problems require federal solutions. So you're going to cooperate with the FBI. I'm going to have a conversation, he said carefully. There's a difference. A semantic one. The corner of his mouth moved. A legal one, which matters. He shifted and she watched him absorb the movement. Webb has been building her Castellano case for 18 months. What I can give her will take it from almost there to airtight. Locations, dates, transactions, intermediaries. 20 years of knowledge doesn't disappear because someone puts you in a basement. And in exchange, certain considerations, he said. For me, for James. He paused. And for you. She went still. I don't need... You made a phone call from your registered number to a known associate of a federal organized crime target, he said with the precise tone of someone laying out a chessboard. That call exists in the record whether you like it or not. I can ensure that when Webb's people pull that record, there's already a context for it that protects you. That makes you a good Samaritan instead of an accomplice. He held her gaze. I'm going to do that regardless of whether you agree to it. But I wanted you to know I was doing it. Elena looked at him for a long moment. The IV line ran from the bag on the makeshift stand to the back of his hand. The fluorescent light above was slightly too bright. Outside, she could hear the distant sound of the coast, the particular quality of wind near water. You spent 20 years building something that required you to be someone I'd be afraid of, she said. And then you spent 3 days in a basement getting turned back into a person. She paused. Which one is the real one? He didn't answer immediately. She respected that. She'd learned to be deeply suspicious of people who answered questions like that too quickly. Both, he said finally. That's the honest answer. Both of them are real. The question is which one I choose to feed going forward. He stopped. Talking to you down there and since is the first time in a very long time that someone has spoken to me like I'm a person who has the capacity to make a different choice. Not like I'm a position to be dealt with, or a threat to be managed, or an asset to be leveraged. He said it plainly without performing emotion, which made it land harder than any performance would have. I don't take that lightly. Elena opened her mouth to respond. James came through the door at exactly the wrong moment, which was also the right moment because she wasn't sure she knew what she was going to say. Webb wants a meeting, James said. She'll come here, tonight. Dominic looked at Elena. She looked at Dominic. Tonight, he said. All right, there's something else. James's voice had the particular flatness of a man delivering bad news he had rehearsed. Rivera, the lieutenant who didn't flip to Marcus, he reached out an hour ago. He's been running his own surveillance on Marcus since the disappearance. He paused. Elena, your name came up in one of Marcus's internal communications. He got a partial plate from the car you drove to the mansion. His people ran it. The room was very quiet. He knows who I am, Elena said. He has your name and your home address, James said. The woman I sent to Mrs. Carver's is already there. Noah is safe. But Marcus reached out to one of his street-level contacts in Dorchester this afternoon and tasked him with, he stopped, chose the word with some care. Surveillance. Don't, Elena said sharply. Don't soften it. What did Marcus task him with? James looked at her steadily. Finding out how much you know and eliminating the exposure. The phrase landed in the room like something physical. Elena sat with it. She had heard words like that before in movies and crime novels and news reports about other people's lives. She had never sat in a room and heard them applied to herself. She breathed. In, out, controlled. Then there's no going home, she said. Not as a question. Not until this is resolved, James said. I'm sorry. She looked at her hands for a moment. She thought about her kitchen, the pile of bills on the table, the cracked tile above the stove, the ordinary scaffolding of her ordinary life, all of it sitting there in Dorchester, inaccessible now, a life in storage. Noah stays where he is, she said. Protected. Yes. And Marcus, does he know yet that Dominic is alive and mobile? He knows Dominic wasn't at the mansion when his men arrived, James said. He doesn't know how far along recovery is. He'll be assuming worse than the reality which gives us a window. How wide a window? Webb coming tonight narrows it considerably, James said. Once we bring the FBI into this room, Marcus's ability to operate freely in this city starts compressing. He'll know that, or he'll figure it out quickly, and when he does, he'll move to consolidate. Fast. Dominic spoke from the bed. His voice was stronger than it had been 20 minutes ago, not recovered, but gathering. What Marcus will do when he feels cornered is reach out to Castellano and ask for direct intervention. That's his insurance policy. He has something on Castellano, I don't know what, but it's the only leverage that would make Castellano willing to expose himself by getting directly involved. What kind of something? Elena asked. Something Castellano would kill to keep quiet, Dominic said, which means it's valuable. And if we can identify it before Marcus deploys it, we take away his last piece of cover. Elena looked at James. Rivera, the lieutenant who held, does he have access to Marcus's communications? Actual access. Limited, James said, and she saw the moment he caught her direction. But he's been inside the circle recently enough to know who Marcus trusts as a courier between himself and Castellano. If we know the courier, Elena said, we know the communication. And if we know the communication, we know the leverage, Dominic finished. He was watching her with an expression she was starting to recognize, the one that meant she'd gotten there before he expected her to. Get Rivera on the phone, she said to James. James looked at Dominic. Dominic gave the smallest nod. James pulled out his phone. It was, Elena would think later, the moment she stopped being a bystander in this story and started being a participant in it. The line was fine, and she crossed it with a clarity that surprised her. Not recklessly, not naively, but with the same deliberate qualities she brought to every hard choice she'd ever made. Eyes open, fully informed, no illusions about the cost. Rivera's voice on the phone was low and tightly controlled, the voice of a man operating inside hostile territory and very aware of it. James spoke to him, first establishing, and then handed the phone to Elena, which surprised Rivera into a brief, unguarded silence. Mr. Rivera, she said, my name is Elena Vasquez. I know you have no reason to trust me. I'm going to ask you one question, and I need you to answer it honestly. The courier between Marcus and Castellano, do you have a name? A pause that lasted long enough that she thought he was going to hang up. Then Ferreira, Tony Ferreira. He moves between them twice a week, Thursday nights and Monday mornings. Another pause. Who did you say you were? Someone who found Dominic Crane in a basement 3 days after your employer left him there to dish, she said. Jay, that's all you need to know. She handed the phone back to James and looked at Dominic. Thursday is tomorrow, she said. I know, he said. If we can get to Ferreira before he makes the Thursday delivery, we intercept the communication and we find out what Marcus has on Castellano. He held her gaze. That's a dangerous move, Elena. Ferreira is not a soft target. None of this is soft, she said. We know that. He was quiet for a moment. The IV dripped. The wind moved outside. When Webb gets here tonight, he said, that's what I offer her, Ferreira, the communication, the leverage, in exchange for immunity coverage that includes you full stop, non-negotiable, and relocation options for Noah if the situation requires it after resolution. He paused. She'll take it. She's been waiting 18 months for an entry point into the Castellano network. I'm handing her the door. Elena nodded slowly. It was a plan, a real one with moving parts that could be traced and anticipated, not the desperate improvisation of the last several hours, but something with architecture. She could work with architecture. There's one more thing, James said, and his voice had shifted again, that controlled flatness that she now understood was his signal for something hard coming. Rivera said something else before you got on the phone. I didn't want to say it in front of you before I told Dominic first, but he looked at Dominic. Marcus is at the mansion. He went back himself tonight. He's looking for something, and Rivera thinks it's documents, physical files that Dominic kept there, things that would be valuable to Castellano. Dominic went very still. The safe, he said. Behind the panel in the east wall of the study, James confirmed. Rivera heard Marcus talking about it. What's in the safe? Elena asked. Dominic looked at the ceiling for a moment. A long exhale. Everything, he said. 20 years of everything. Enough to take down not just Marcus, but half the power structure of this city, he paused. And enough to take me down with it. The room held that information for a moment. Marcus doesn't have the combination, Dominic said. He knows the safe exists, he must have found out from someone, but he can't open it without the sequence. He'll bring someone to cut it. That takes time, but not unlimited time. How long? Elena asked. If he has the right people, 8 hours, maybe 10. She looked at the clock on the wall. It was 6:47 in the evening. Webb gets here when, she asked James. She said 9. Then we have a 2-hour window before she arrives to brief Dominic on what to offer. She was already thinking through it, the sequence, the priorities, the contingencies. When Webb gets here, the first thing on the table is the safe. She needs to move on the mansion tonight before Marcus gets into it. That becomes her immediate win, the documentation, and in exchange we get the protection and the forward operation against Castellano. James looked at her with something that had moved all the way past recalibration into something that might from a certain angle have resembled respect. That's a strong opening position. It's the only opening position, she said. We're not negotiating from weakness. We're holding the one piece of information Webb needs most. She looked at Dominic. Are you strong enough to be lucid for a federal agent at 9 o'clock tonight? I'll be lucid, he said with a flatness that said the question was almost offensive. Good. She stood up. Then I'm going to need coffee, real coffee, and I'm going to need someone to check in with the woman watching Noah. She looked at James. And I need the full layout of what you know about Ferreira, where he moves, what his patterns are, who he's connected to, before Webb arrives, so that when Dominic puts him on the table, I have enough working knowledge to fill gaps if the conversation requires it. James Chen looked at her for one complete second. You've done this before, he said. Not an accusation, an assessment. I've managed a 12-year-old, a cleaning business, debt collectors, and a landlord who once tried to evict me on Christmas Eve, she said evenly. Different category, same skill set. Dominic made a sound from the bed. It took her a moment to identify it. It was a laugh short, genuine, surprised out of him. She hadn't heard him laugh before. It changed his face in a way she hadn't expected. Made him look like someone she might have met under completely different circumstances and found worth knowing. She turned away before she could think too long about that. There was work to do. There was always work to do, and Elena Vasquez had never once in her life let the work wait because of feelings. She went to find the coffee. Behind her, she heard Dominic say to James quietly, "Where did she come from, Ma?" And James, with the absolute economy of someone who never wasted words, said only, "South Boston. Same as you." Agent Carla Webb arrived at 8:53, which told Elena two things immediately: that she'd been moving toward this location before James called, and that she was not someone who let other people control the timing of anything. She was 40, maybe 42, with the kind of face that had learned to reveal nothing and had been practicing long enough that the practice had become the face. She came in alone, which was either a gesture of good faith or a statement about how little she feared the room. She looked at James, who she clearly knew. She looked at Dominic, who she'd clearly been thinking about for some time. And then she looked at Elena, and her eyes stayed there a beat longer than they stayed anywhere else. "Ms. Vasquez," she said, "you've had quite a Tuesday." "I have," Elena said. Sit down. We have a lot to cover and not much time to cover it. Webb looked at her with something that was not quite amusement and not quite surprise and was located exactly between the two. Then she sat. The meeting lasted 51 minutes. Elena had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything that mattered methodically without sentiment, starting with what was most valuable and building outward. She let Dominic take the lead because it was his world, his language, his 2 decades of knowledge. But when he flagged twice when the fever that doctor, Park had beaten back, tried to reassert itself in the form of a lag between thought and speech. Elena stepped in without hesitation, filling the gap, presenting the Ferreira thread with enough precision that Webb leaned forward in her chair and stayed forward. The safe was the opening bid. Webb's reaction to it was the most unguarded moment Elena saw from her all night, a brief, total stillness, like a bird dog pointing. 20 years of documentation sitting behind a panel in a mansion in South Boston, with Marcus currently trying to cut through the lock. I need that safe, Webb said. We know, Elena said. That's why it's first. I can have a team at that location in 30 minutes. You need to have a team there in 20, Dominic said. He has people who can crack the mechanism. He's been there since before 6. You're already working against the clock. Webb had her phone out before he finished the sentence. She stepped away from the table, and Elena heard the controlled urgency of the call clip, precise, no wasted syllables, and came back 90 seconds later with the particular expression of someone who has just set something large and irreversible in motion. Team is moving, she said. What else? What else was Ferreira? The Thursday night communication. The leverage Marcus held over Castellano, unknown in content, but known in existence, which was enough for Webb to build an intercept operation around if they moved before the morning. Elena watched Webb process it, watched her fit it against 18 months of her own accumulated knowledge, watched the moment it clicked into place and opened something that had been closed. If Ferreira is carrying what you think he's carrying, Webb said carefully, and we intercept the Thursday delivery, you get Castellano, Dominic said, not just his organization. Him, personally implicated. Whatever Marcus has on him, the fact that he's been paying to suppress it through a criminal courier is prosecutable on its own, separate from everything else. Webb sat back. She was quiet for exactly 8 seconds, Elena counted, because she had started counting silences, the way other people counted money, measuring what they cost and what they were worth. Full immunity for Ms. Vasquez, Webb said. Clean. No asterisks, no conditions, no future cooperation requirements. She walks away from this as a protected witness who rendered humanitarian assistance, period. Agreed, Dominic said before Elena could speak. Reduced exposure for James Chen to be negotiated separately based on full disclosure. James, from the corner where he'd been standing for the entire meeting like a piece of furniture that was paying very close attention, nodded once. And for you, Bo, Webb said, turning to Dominic, we're not talking immunity. You've been in this city for 20 years, and you know I cannot offer you a clean slate. What I can offer is a negotiated resolution cooperation credit sentencing, consideration and protection during the resolution period. That's the ceiling. Dominic held her gaze. I know what the ceiling is, he said. I've known for a long time. I'm not asking for a clean slate. I'm asking for a chance to make the ending of this story different from the middle of it. Webb looked at him for a long moment. Then we have a deal, she said. The handshake was brief and formal, and Elena thought it was one of the stranger things she'd witnessed in a day that had been full of strange things. Then Webb's phone rang. She answered it, listened, and the controlled surface of her face cracked just slightly, just at the edges in a way that made Elena's stomach drop before Webb had said a single word. Say that again, Webb said into the phone. A pause. How many? Another pause shorter. Secure the perimeter. Nobody in or out. I'm 20 minutes away. She ended the call and looked at Dominic. My team reached the mansion, she said. Marcus was still there. Was it? Dominic said. He had 4 men with him. When the team moved in, there was an exchange. She stopped. Marcus is in custody. 2 of his men are in custody. One of my agents took a round to the shoulder. He's stable. She paused. And Roman Castellano was in that house. The room held that for a moment. Castellano was at the mansion, James said. Not a question. Processing. In person, Webb said, which means Marcus had already moved to the direct intervention stage. He called in his insurance policy. She looked at Dominic. The timeline moved faster than you projected. Castellano came himself, Dominic said slowly. Something was working behind his eyes, not surprise, but a deep grinding recognition. That means the leverage Marcus had was immediate, something Castellano couldn't manage through intermediaries, something that required him to be present to control. We'll know what it is when we open the safe, Webb said. She was already moving, already reaching for her jacket. I need to be at that scene. She looked at Elena one last time. Ms. Vasquez, stay here. Stay with James. I'll have agents outside this location within the hour. You're covered. She was out the door before Elena could respond, which was fine because Elena wasn't planning to stay. She turned to James. James was already looking at her with an expression that said he knew exactly what she was about to say and had a prepared objection. Don't, she said. He needs to stay stable. He's more stable than he was 4 hours ago, and we both know it. She looked at Dominic. You want to be there? It wasn't a question. Marcus is in custody, he said, quiet, contained, but she could hear what was underneath it, 20 years of history, a brother's betrayal, 3 days on a basement floor, and now the moment of reckoning, sitting one car right away. I need to see him. Dominic, James started. James. His voice was calm and final. Get the car. James got the car. They drove to the mansion with two of Webb's agents who had arrived at the Marshfield property 6 minutes after Webb left, summoned by Webb, who had apparently anticipated that her instructions to stay put would not be followed and had made provisions accordingly. Elena sat in the back beside Dominic and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. She could feel the particular tension in him, not the pain tension of the last 24 hours, but something different, something older. The tension of a man walking towards something he'd been avoiding his whole adult life and had finally run out of road to avoid it on. They arrived to controlled chaos. Vehicles, lights, agents moving with purpose. The front door of the mansion was open, genuinely open. Not the half-open tilt Elena had noticed this morning, which now felt like a memory from someone else's life. She'd been inside that house 12 hours ago, with a mop and a first aid kit. The distance between that moment and this one was not measurable in time. Webb met them at the gate. She looked at Dominic's presence with the expression of someone who had expected exactly this and had decided not to spend energy objecting to it. The safe is open, she said. It's substantial. We're going to be processing it for weeks. A pause. Castellano is lawyered up already. Marcus. She stopped. Where is he? Dominic said. Webb looked at him steadily. He's asking for you. The silence that produced was different from all the silences that had preceded it. Elena put her hand on Dominic's arm, not stopping him, just present. He looked down at her hand and then at her face, and she saw him make a decision. She didn't know exactly what the decision was, but she watched him make it. Take me to him on, Dominic said to Webb. They brought Marcus out to the front of the property in custody, cuffed, flanked, and Elena stayed back because this was not hers, this part. She stood at a distance and watched. Marcus Crane was smaller than she'd imagined. She didn't know why she'd imagined him as large, maybe because Dominic was large, and because the shadow a person casts in your mind, when you've been afraid of them, tends to grow beyond what's actually there. He was lean, dark-haired like Dominic, but narrower in the face with the particular stillness of a man who has been planning something for so long that even getting caught feels like a controlled event. She couldn't hear what they said to each other. She was too far away, and she understood she was meant to be too far away. But she could see them, the two of them, the full brother and the half-brother, standing in front of the house where Marcus had left Dominic to die, and she watched the shape of the conversation without its words. She watched Dominic stand without leaning, which cost him something she could see from 30 feet away. She watched Marcus say something that made Dominic go very still. She watched Dominic respond short, measured, and she watched something happen in Marcus's face that she couldn't name from the distance. Later, she asked Dominic what Marcus had said. He said he didn't expect me to still be standing, Dominic told her. What did you say back? I said that was his mistake. He'd spent 20 years watching me, and he still got it wrong. A pause. He thought I survived because I was powerful. I survived because someone with no reason to help me chose to anyway. Those aren't the same thing. What did he say to that? Dominic was quiet for a moment. Nothing. He just looked at me. And I think for the first time in 20 years, he actually saw me. Not the position, not the threat, me. He exhaled slowly. I don't know if that means anything, but it meant something to me. Elena nodded. She understood. Some reckonings don't resolve cleanly. They just become something you carry differently. Dominic turned Marcus over to Webb's custody without asking for anything else. No final words. No settling of old scores the way the old Dominic might have settled them. He turned and walked back toward the car, and Elena fell into step beside him. The FBI will get a conviction, she asked. For Marcus, yes. The documentation from the safe alone will take care of it. He moved carefully but steadily. Castellano is more complicated, but Webb is good. She'll build it. He glanced at her sideways. Rivera testified to Ferreira's role tonight. Webb's team picked up Ferreira at 9:40. The Thursday delivery isn't happening. So it's done. The immediate danger is done, he said. The rest takes time. It always takes time. He stopped walking and turned to look at her. His face in the light was still bruised, still carrying the evidence of everything the last several days had been. But it was also, she thought, more honest than any face she'd seen in a long time. Noah can go home tomorrow. Webb's people will watch your apartment for another week as a precaution, but the direct threat is removed. She breathed. The knowledge of it that Noah could go home, that Mrs. Carver's kitchen was a temporary arrangement and not a permanent one, that the cracked tile above her stove was hers to go back to settled into her chest like something she hadn't realized she'd been holding up. And you, she asked? I have a long conversation ahead of me with federal prosecutors, he said. It starts Monday. It'll run for, he paused, a while. Will you lose everything? He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. The empire, he said. Yes, that's already over. It was over the moment I shook Webb's hand. He said it without flinching. Some things aren't worth saving. Some things needed to be over before they ended someone who didn't deserve to be ended. She thought about the councilman, the car accident that wasn't. She thought about the life that had been built on a foundation that included that story and others like it, and she thought about the fact that the man standing next to her, the one who had looked at her across a cold basement floor with burning dark eyes and told her not to make phone calls, was not the same man who had built all of that, even if he wore the same face. People changed. She believed that. She believed it because she had to, because the alternative was a closed universe where no one ever became anyone different, and she had spent her whole life refusing to live in that universe. What happens to you, she pressed, after the prosecution, after the cooperation, you specifically? I don't know specifically, he said. That's the honest answer. He held her gaze. But I know what I want to happen. For the first time in a long time, I know what I want. That's not nothing. She looked at him. She thought about a woman who came to clean an empty house on a Tuesday morning and found a dying man and chose to stay. She thought about how a single choice made in a single moment could redirect everything, not just for yourself, but for another person who didn't know they needed redirecting. She thought about her grandmother. Walking away from someone who needed you isn't surviving. It's just a slower way of dying inside. When this is through, she said carefully, and you're on the other side of it, whatever that looks like, you're going to need to figure out who you are without the thing that defined you for 20 years. She paused. That's hard. I know what it's like to rebuild from nothing. It's the hardest thing there is. She held his gaze. But it's also the only thing that actually means anything. Dominic Crane, former king of Boston's criminal underworld man, who had been left for dead by his own blood man, who had looked at his reflection in a cold basement floor and found it wanting, looked at Elena Vasquez for a long moment without speaking. I know, he said, and she heard in those two words everything he didn't say, which was the most important part of what he meant. James appeared at the edge of the driveway. Car's ready. I can take Ms. Vasquez home or to Mrs. Carver's to get Noah, whichever she wants. Elena looked at Dominic one more time. He was going with Webb. The negotiation process started tonight, apparently, because Webb was that kind of person, and Dominic had agreed because he understood that delay was its own kind of debt. Get some sleep, she said, which was possibly the least profound thing she could have said in the moment, and also exactly the right thing. And she knew it was right because he almost smiled again, that real one, the one that changed his face. You too, he said. Elena. She walked to the car. She got in. James drove and she sat in the back and watched the city come back into focus around her. The lights, the streets, the ordinary geography of a life she was returning to with different eyes than she'd left it with. Noah was at Mrs. Carver's when she arrived, already half asleep on the couch with the television running low and a blanket pulled up to his chin. He opened his eyes when she came in and looked at her the way 12-year-olds look at their mothers when they've been slightly worried and don't want to admit it. You look tired, he said. I am tired, she said, sitting on the edge of the couch beside him. Long day. The good kind or the bad kind? She thought about a man on a basement floor, a brother who smiled and planned and waited 20 years, a federal agent who wore a controlled face and leaned forward when it mattered, a car driving away from a Marshfield property in the dark. All of it, the whole shape of the day. The kind that means something, she said. He accepted that the way he accepted things, quietly storing it for later examination. She pulled the blanket up higher, and he let her, which at 12 he didn't always, and she sat with him until his eyes closed and his breathing evened out, and she was sure he was actually asleep. Then she sat a little longer because she could. 3 weeks later, Elena Vasquez received a letter through a federal prosecutor's office, a single page handwritten with no return address delivered through official channels as a condition of correspondence protocol. She stood in her kitchen with the morning light coming in, and she read it twice before she set it on the counter. It said, I don't know who you are yet beyond what the last 3 days revealed. But I know what you did. I know what it cost you. I know you stayed when you didn't have to, and I know that isn't something everyone has in them. I'm told I'm not supposed to have contact of this nature through this channel, and I'm doing it anyway, which some people would say is a sign that I haven't changed. I prefer to think of it as evidence that some things are worth the risk. I hope Noah is well. I hope the tile above your stove is fixed. Elena read it a third time. Then she folded it carefully, put it in the drawer beneath the counter, where she kept the things that mattered, and went to make coffee. Outside, Boston was already moving loud and relentless and entirely indifferent to the private reckonings of individuals, which was fine. It had always been fine. Elena Vasquez had never needed the city to witness her. She had only ever needed to know inside herself that when it had mattered most, she had made the right call. She had found a man dying in a basement, and she had stayed. Everything else was just a story that followed from that one true thing, and some stories, once they start, don't stop being worth telling.